let's just start with the most obvious one that I say the most obvious one, the most common thing that comes up when you ask somebody, why don't you go to church? The thing is, well, it's full of hypocrites. Well, my answer, this would not be my answer to that person, but I think if we look at why people are not going to church, there is some truth in what is being said, especially with the current generation. Mm-hmm. Because here's what a hypocrite is. A hypocrite is somebody who says one thing and does something different. Mm-hmm. That is a hypocrite. So if you're coming to church and you're embracing everything the church says, but then you go out and you live a different way, what people are seeing out of you on Monday through Saturday is different than what they see between 10 a.m. and 12 noon on Sunday, or whatever time you happen to be inside a church building. If that's different, there is a hypocritical element there. Mm-hmm. My opinion is, and part of the reason this ministry even exists, is that we want people to understand what you do from the time you walk out of the church till the time you come back. That is being a Christian. Mm-hmm. It's not that time when you're inside the church. And I think a lot of people don't see a difference there. They don't see people passionate about their faith. And so they say, why should I go down there and waste 2 hours on a perfectly good Sunday morning when I could be fishing or buying my groceries or something else, if all these people that are doing that look no different than the rest of us the rest of the week? So that's the first thing. I think if you want people to come to your church, be passionate about your church. Live out the faith. Do not just check a box. Box checking is a thing of the past as far as impressing anybody or getting someone motivated to come join you at church.
Right. The hypocrite issue is a bit of a nuanced one, in my opinion, because there's legitimacy on both sides of the argument, which you already pointed out. On the one hand, going to church should not be something that you do because all of the people there are perfect. In fact, the very point of church is that it is a group of people who are seeking salvation from one who is perfect. You know, by being a Christian, you presuppose that you are a sinner. Of course, once you're saved, you are expected to live righteously. And beyond that, Christ ascended to the Father, and he gave us the Spirit, and we are his representatives here. Therefore, if we are not living up to that, that does bring reproach on his name, or at least the church's name, which, how closely should those two be tied, you know? The other thing I'll say is, I am not convinced personally that if the church had no hypocrites in it, there would be more attendees. We always assume that if people in the church were better, there would be more people there. And is that the case? Yes, but I also think there would be less people there. Think about Jesus, for example. There could never be a more perfect representative of the faith. Not everyone followed him. In fact, there were some people that followed him, and then when he gave certain teachings, departed from him. Many were exposed to him and his great wisdom and teaching and righteousness, and decided to go the other way. So, a lot of things to consider here, and I suppose for these reasons, I don't jump to conclusions immediately when I hear such arguments.
Well, what I would say is, what you're really saying is there's two types of people attending church. Mm-hmm. There are your box checkers. They go to church on Sunday because it's the culturally accepted thing to do, because that's what grandma did. It's because they feel like they need to. But once church is over, they don't really think about church throughout the week. They don't read their Bibles. They're not, as a general rule, making their life decisions based on what the Bible says and spiritual principles. And so you got that group of people. And then you have the people who are sincerely going to church because they're trying to grow spiritually. I think there's two different groups there. Mm-hmm. And so what we need to do is get more people from the first group into the second group. Right. To me, the second group, I would not classify them as hypocrites. I would classify them as imperfect, as you mentioned. They're always going to be imperfect. We're never going to get there. But we have to realize that first group, the box checkers, I'll call them, they're probably doing more to hinder church growth and spiritual development at large, in the larger community, than they're helping it, because they go out and they're misrepresenting what it means to go to church or to be a Christian. So that, I guess that's kind of my take on that. One of the things I think we need to move past in the Christian world, at least in the South where I grew up, if I'll just use this as an example,
sure,
to kind of demonstrate a point. If I brought a girl home, I was single, and I was going to start dating somebody, a question I might get is, now, does she go to church? Mm-hmm. Right? And that was, going to church was like the measure of her spiritual temperature. And I mean, it's prevalent, I would say, throughout the South. If you're evaluating someone's spiritual health, the first question is, do they go to church? Well, that might be a good place to start if you were going to ask other questions, but generally that's the only question that would get asked. And once the answer was yes, they go to church, it was assumed that all these other things followed, which it very often did not. And so what I wish we would do is just get rid of that question and ask a question that something along the lines of, where are they spiritually? Where are they as a Christ follower? Do we need to go to church? Absolutely. The bulk of this podcast is going to be dedicated to why we should go to church. But going to church, whether we're inside the church measuring others, or whether we're one of those box checkers saying, I go to church, therefore I'm okay, that should be done away with as a measurement of our overall spiritual health. It's a tiny sliver of our spiritual health that should inform how we're growing otherwise. Because if we're going into a healthy church and we're involved in that church, we should be developing and growing spiritually. But just saying I go to church is not enough.
Yeah. You bring up a lot of interesting points there. One is that you have these two categories of Christians, and one of them you say, I would not define these as hypocrites. So the question that I have is, what is a hypocrite? And this is a question that I would put to those who say that the church is full of hypocrites. Define hypocrite. Well, it's someone who doesn't do what they say. Well, what Christians aspire to is Jesus' example, otherwise known as moral perfection. And we know that there is none who is righteous, no, not one, except Christ. So we know that you don't mean perfect. So instead what you mean is somewhere on the continuum between Jesus and the devil, right? And it is very likely the case that the point that you've chosen on the continuum is arbitrary. And probably what most people mean when they say that, it's kind of like when people are asked to define a rich person. Well, a rich person is someone who's richer than me. Or what is a poor person? A poor person is someone who's poorer than me. Or you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
A hypocrite is someone who doesn't take their faith as seriously as I do. And a non-hypocrite is someone who takes their faith as seriously as I do, or more seriously. Well, just think about what you're saying there and the kind of judgments that you're making. Do you really want to say that you take your faith more seriously than somebody else? Are you sure about that? And how much of that judgment is predicated on assumptions that you're making about that person, not knowing them very well?
Well, let me interrupt you here and say, it's not our job to judge any particular person. I'm making when I divided those two groups, I'm making kind of a broad, sweeping generalization from observation. And, I could call out specific people to say, I believe this one fits in this category, that this one fits in that category. That's not really the point. The point is that if you're going to church, you should be making a sincere effort to grow in your faith and to grow as a Christian and to represent that body well. if you look at other organizations, they have standards, and if you don't meet those standards or misrepresent them by how you do things outside of that organization, they boot you out, right? I mean, the church theoretically does that too. It doesn't happen very often anymore. But, we should self-impose a standard. And for me, the standard is not where you're at on that continuum you laid out. It's, are you moving on that continuum, right? Are you getting better? There's probably some line out there that, everybody has a different mark. If you get on this side of the line, maybe you're better. But, I like to see people moving, even people that have been in it a long time. We're never going to get to that perfection, but we should be inching towards it. We should be at least applying ourselves to move toward it. Even if we're unsuccessful, we should be striving. Paul said he was striving toward the mark of the high calling. That's what all of us should be doing. What my concern is the people that walk out the church on Sunday and there is no striving. There is no concern. There is no thought for how is this action that I'm about to take going to reflect on my family, which should be the church. You and I have talked about the fact that the church family should actually even be closer to us than our blood family. So how is this action that I'm taking reflecting on my family? How is it reflecting on Christ? The words that I say, the actions that I take, how I do other people. And so when I see people who seemingly have no concern for that, that's the group I put into that box checking group. Or the people I put into that group. Yeah.
I'm remembering right now something John Schoenberger said when he was on our podcast in response to the criticism, well, church is just full of hypocrites. He says, well, don't come. We don't need another one, right? How do you know that you are not a hypocrite yourself? And even if you're not a hypocrite, how do you know that you don't look like a hypocrite to others? So that's a good question to ask.